Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Hello. My question is, what can we do to benefit humanity most at this time?
Dear Thai, dear community, first of all, thank you for your question. This is a question that I often ask myself, and I think it's a good question to ask, maybe every day. I remember it was about 18 years ago, the first time I came to Plum Village, and I was sitting in this hall listening to Thai give a Dharma talk, and I think I had a lot of anger in me and a lot of despair, and a sense that the situation was desperate in terms of the environment and economic and social problems, inequality, injustice, and this kind of thing. And I just felt very, I felt upset and angry, and I knew I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what to do. And mostly, I think I didn't do anything very helpful. I mostly just complained and had complicated political discussions with my friends and complained about how terrible the situation was, and I was in a state of despair. I didn't know what to do. And as I listened to Thai, I started to see something that I can really say changed my life completely. I saw that whatever situation I'm in, and whatever I try to do, the biggest obstacle is myself. My own wrong perceptions, my own misunderstanding maybe of the difficulty, and even in my intense desire to help, I saw that very often I make the situation worse because of my anger, because of my judgment, and because somehow I started to see there were blocks of suffering in myself that were a kind of an obstacle to the free flow of my energy and my aspiration to help. And Thai taught us, as he always does, that at any moment, whatever we're doing, at any moment, we can cultivate the energy of mindfulness just by bringing our awareness back to our breathing. And with the awareness of our breathing, we can become aware of our body, we can relax, we can become aware of our emotions, we can take care of our emotions if there's anger there or tension of any kind. And I suddenly saw how this was actually something that I could do always do in any situation, and it would always help. It would always help to make me more authentic, to bring me closer in touch with the situation in front of me, to help me to see more clearly the suffering and the problem. And I learned from experience that this process of bringing the mind back to the body, to the feelings, calming the thinking, being able to quiet the thinking completely, I learned from experience that I could trust that process, and that by stilling my mind, I could, it seemed that a different kind of solution would present itself, a kind of insight. Maybe not a big insight, but maybe even just a little insight, but something different. Not something I could have thought of logically. And I really started to trust that process. And I saw that it's always available, and it always helps. Thank you for your question. So, dear Thai, dear Sangha, maybe we can have a written question. There are two questions here that are closely related. So one is about the second mindfulness training. There is a phrase in the second mindfulness training which says, we can live happily in the present moment simply by recognizing that we already have more than enough conditions to be happy. So, how do we know if it is right to pursue a dream which would involve changing our situations, our life situation? So given that we know that we already have more than enough conditions to be happy, how do we know whether it's right to pursue a dream that would involve changing our situation or conditions? And this, another question. If a dream or desires keep coming up in your thoughts, how do we know if there's something from the heart that we should follow and fulfill, or just another story created by our mind? As following the heart may require making big changes in life. Thank you.
So dear Thầy, dear Sangha, the second mindfulness training. So the question is, what about pursuing a dream when we know that we have everything so perfect and enough happiness conditions all around? So what else do we have to do? We don't have to do anything. So what about pursuing a dream? Doing something for the betterment. What about that? That's a very good question. I like it. Knowing that we have all the happy conditions around us, everything we do will be more enjoyable. Doing something for the betterment would be more enjoyable. We know that there's still war around us in some countries. We know that hunger is still there in the corner somewhere. We know that there's still women and children crying somewhere at this moment. We know that someone is occupied by anger at this moment. And what can we do? We know that we live in the same family, this planet Earth, and everybody is our brothers and sisters. We want to do something. They're so far away, but we know for sure at this moment there's something going on out there, outside of Plum village. Some tears shed, some argument, dispute going on between countries, between people, between father and son, mother and daughter. And again, we want to do something. And if we don't have the practice, sometimes we overwhelm ourselves with all of these difficulties and suffering in the world. And if we don't come together, if we don't share with each other as group of friends, as sangha, as family to talk about it, and we hold that to ourselves, and it would become very heavy. Sometimes we will feel powerless by ourselves. We cannot do much. So we come together, yes, we come together at this moment. We talk about it. We talk about the second mindfulness trainings. A practice, a wonderful practice for us to come back to ourselves and have all of that nourishment so that we can nourish ourselves to be strong in body and mind. We know that the sun is doing very well. That's why we're here. If the sun's not doing what he's doing, if he's getting so close to us, we would get very hot. We know that the trees are doing very well. That's why the oxygen is still here for us, so fresh and comfortable to breathe. And we know all these happiness, happy conditions available for us like that. We have gratitude to everything, to all that is around us. And with that happiness, we can nourish ourselves and other peoples. And then we can talk about difficulties. And then we can look more deeply into situation. And then we can pursue a dream for betterment, a dream for less tear, a dream for more smiles all around.
I'd like to add a little bit to that answer. I don't think pursuing a dream and being happy in the present moment and content with what you have are mutually exclusive things. It's very possible to be happy now and recognize that we have enough conditions to be happy, and at the same time have the dream. What that means is that while you are pursuing the dream, you don't sacrifice your life or your happiness for the sake of pursuing the dream. And when you have that in mind, while you are pursuing the dream, you stay grounded. You don't lose your life. I see many people, including myself, when I was younger, I had a dream, and it was just the end goal. And I structured my whole life in order to reach that goal, thinking that was getting there would make me happy. But in truth, I had skipped out on many things. Like when I was in college and pursuing a diploma. Let me describe my dorm room for you so you get the picture. So I went away for college, and I lived in this dorm room, and I kept it very stark. I never hung up any personal pictures or posters or anything. I didn't really, while I saw many of my dorm mates and living in other rooms, I stayed in a single room. You know, they decorated the rooms and made it very comfortable and had all of these comforts around them. And I never did any of that because I just thought these 4 years are temporary and I'm just here to get a diploma. So I kept my room very, very plain, very stark, you can say. And I didn't put anything up. And I never tried to make it comfortable for myself to live in. And even with eating and meals and things like that, when I remember in college, you know, I just went through the motion of eating my breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and most of the time I had a book in front of me or something, and eating was in order to have energy to study, to get the diploma in the end. So the dream was to get this diploma, and I had spent 4 years living my life like that. And unfortunately, during the 4 years, I didn't come across Tay or the Plum Village teachings and things like that. And the first time I met Tay, I was just, you know, my whole system was shocked, you know, that, especially the first meal that I attended, my whole system was just shocked because we were sitting in circles, eating in many circles. It was in this big meditation hall in Green Mountain Dharma Center, and the floor was just dirt, and they'd just thrown a carpet over it to make a functional, temporary functional meditation hall. Nonetheless, we ate in there, and we sat in these, you know, small circles, and I remember enjoying my first meal like that. And everybody around me was chewing. You know, we're instructed to chew 15 times before we swallow, so I followed the instructions. And it was quite amazing, that first experience of mindful eating for me. And what I recognized in that session was that I'd never really eaten before. And I went through university pursuing this degree, and all my life I'd never eaten like that. And it was something so basic to being a human being, like eating. And I just remember being so shocked. So in retrospect, looking at my 4 years of university, I felt, wow, there's so many moments that I missed out. I had completely missed out on my life trying to pursue this diploma, and not really knowing how to eat, how to walk, how to relax, how to rest, how to create this environment for myself that I could be happy in. And none of it was temporary, even though, you know, college only lasts 4 years. But still, I had somewhere in my mind I had acquired the idea that, oh, this is temporary in order to get to something else. And I bet if I, you know, in my job environment, I would probably think, oh, this is temporary, you know, to get to something else, the Nobel Prize or something, I don't know. You know, so many of us, we have dreams and we spend our lives trying to pursue our dreams like that and completely forgetting about, you know, the conditions that we already have to be happy, and also that we can create the conditions for us to be happy right in the present moment. So the two things I don't think are mutually exclusive of one another. And as for this other question, if a dream or desire keeps coming up in your thoughts persistently, how shall we know if there's something from the heart that we shall follow and fulfill, or just another story created by our mind? So I just share my experience again with that. For myself, I think all dreams, however big or small, I think first and foremost, they're only ideas. they're only ideas until you do something about them. Or even when you do something about them, they're still only, they may still only be an idea. And for instance, I had an idea to become monastic, and that was my dream, and it was very strong and very powerful, and it was very persistent, you know. It was eating at me day and night, and I was quite restless when I was at home, and I just kept thinking, gosh, when can I finish planning, letting go of all of these things, planning my life so I can finally get to Plum Village to become a monastic. And so I had all these ideas about becoming a monastic and what it was to be a monk or a nun. And I remember, so I had a friend who was also interested in monasticism, and he had a brother who was already a monk. And we were talking about this after our first retreat, and I was just admiring the way the monks and nuns lived and how the community lived, and you know, they live so simply, and yet they're all so happy. So he made a joke about it, and he said, and you know, they don't even use toilet paper. So I had this big dream of becoming a monastic, okay? But I knew nothing about it, and you know, and because I felt he had some authority, he had a brother who was already a monk, and I completely believed him. I believed him that Plum Village didn't use any toilet paper, you know, and so there were two obstacles really of me becoming a monk or a nun. One was that at the time I had really long hair, and it was difficult to imagine myself bald, and being vain, I didn't know how I would look bald. So I was like, can I do it? Can I be a bald person the rest of my life? Can I lose my hair? And I didn't even know what it meant to, you know, the meaning behind being bald as a monastic. I just thought, I don't know if I could lose my hair as a nun. And the other obstacle was that toilet paper thing. And I felt, you know, gosh, can I live in a community that doesn't use toilet paper? You know, and I'd already graduated from university, and this was one of the things, you know. Yeah, but the no toilet paper was only the beginning of like an idea, a life of, that I thought was the beginning of a life of austerity and asceticism, is it? Yeah, asceticism. So I didn't know if I could do it. So the biggest obstacle was, can I live without toilet paper? You know, and then I came to Plum Village in the winter of 2000, in November. And I remember the first time stepping into this toilet stall. And back then, you know, Plum Village, they used this pink toilet paper, Eco Plus or Lotus or whatever, and I just felt my pupils like dilating when I saw this toilet paper, because it was such a huge reality check, you know, for me. I had this idea of becoming a nun, and I spent all this time letting go of the idea of not using toilet paper. And I came here, and I was faced with, wow, this community uses toilet paper. So it was like a whole re-evaluation of my dream. You know, I had to re-evaluate what it meant to become a nun using toilet paper. You know? So I just want to say that whatever dream you have, it's first and foremost just an idea. And you have to spend your time, all of us, I think we have to spend our time investigating our dream. Whatever it is we want to do, we have to find more about it, and we have to do this kind of reality check. Otherwise, it just remains an idea. whether you want to become a nun, a monk, whether you want to bring peace to the world, you kind of have to investigate it. And I see many people with dreams of world peace, for instance, and yet in their daily life, you see how they walk, you see how they talk, you see how they eat, you see how they consume, and none of it has to do with world peace. So like you have an idea of world peace, but what are you doing in your life to bring about world peace? So the dream and the reality, we kind of have to check. And even if you are in the process of pursuing it, it's a moment-to-moment kind of reality check for me. Even now, I'm still checking my dream as a nun. And every day, I see my pupils dilating over something or other. Yeah. Thank you very much for listening.
My question is about nonviolence and self-defense, and if there is ever a reason or an excuse for violence.
So, dear Thai, dear Sangha, the question is about non-violence and self-defense. And the question is, if there is ever a reason or an excuse to use violence.
Dear Thai, dear community, dear friend, thank you for your question. Listening to your question, I feel you have a wound inside. And going along with the wound is a fear, insecurity. And also going along with that, there's violence inside. And then self-defense. One of the practice we are doing here is generating the energy of peace, of uniting our body and our mind together so that we can be there for ourselves, be grounded, be in touch with the peace already in us and surrounding us, so that we can feel we are safe, we have a refuge to take in us, so that we can protect ourselves from our own violence in terms of thinking, in terms of speaking, in terms of bodily action, the three actions. And that is one of the best self-defense. Self-defense by being peaceful, present, and compassionate to ourselves. And that energy can be very powerful. It is empowered by the energy of understanding and love. We know what to do and what not to do in which situation. And in each situation we can feel how I am at this moment, in which kind of state, and what is the situation I'm facing, who is that person, or who is that group, or who is the situation. We know ourselves and we know the situation, we know the others. And that knowing, that understanding is very helpful to feel what to do and what not to do out of peace, out of compassion. Yes, there is an excuse, there is a reason we can violence, but this violence is empowered by the motivation of compassion. It's not pushed by the energy of fear, of insecurity. This violence is empowered by the energy of reverence for life, protection life. So the motivation behind of using violence is very important. And we need to really judge, we need to really put on the scale, on the scale, what is the benefit of using violence, what is the damage of not using violence. We need to really make use of our own insight and make use of the collective insight. Coming together and look deeply in order to know. And we know each choice, each decision that we make is not perfect. It's always we sacrifice something when we make a choice like that. We will gain it and we will lose it, and we need to accept both sides in order not to feel guilty, not to feel coming short. I just helped my younger brother with schizophrenia, mental illness, and he was so out of control. He was no longer himself. Very, very violent. On the street, yeah, and he was ready to fight with the people on the street. And I was there as a monk. And he was like desperate, not knowing what to do. And he cried and he asked me, "Can you help to kill me? I'd rather die. I'm so desperate. My life is all suffering." And I knew exactly this time I need to return to my island. I called for the Buddha's help. I remember the story of Lama, the one who killed 99 people, Sister Chinduk talked about. And the Buddha himself was peaceful, steady, and knowing what to do in order to help the Angkuli Lama. And I knew exactly at this moment I need to come back to myself and not to be pulled by the energy of violence. Because I knew I need to reserve my stability, my compassion, and my firmness of there is a way out. And that way is not through violence, that way is not through self-destruction, but that way of being peace, that way of taking care for our emotions, calming ourselves, and taking care for the situation step by step. And holding my energy like that, I can support my younger brother. I'm here for you, and I'm here for you with my peace, my stability, and my compassion. And at one moment, he was about to fight with the people passing by. And with my little martial art, I got him down on the ground. Boom. Sorry. And that was really out of it was really out of compassion, and pinning him down on the ground, I chanted Namo Avalokitesvara for him. And he knew I loved him, I cared for him. He allowed himself to be calm. Yes, there is a reason, a motivation behind that for using violence, but in a reverence way, in a protecting way, and for him and for the people. There is an element of inclusiveness in that. Yeah, there's an inclusiveness, because suffering is not an individual matter, and happiness is not individual matter. It's always linked. So using violence with that insight, with that compassion, and with that inclusiveness, it is possible. Good luck. Maybe you learn some martial arts. Yeah? And learn how to swim and, equip ourselves. It's not easy. Thank you for your question.
My question is, when you aren't quite sure whether the happiness that sits with the sufferings you're facing with right now is the true happiness or not? How should we know that it's worth suffering for? Or do we advise to deal with each and every sufferings we face, no matter what?
Let me check if I understood correctly the question. How do you know if the happiness that arises from suffering is that it's worth the suffering? That it's worth going through that suffering in order to have that happiness? Is that right? Something like that? Okay. Was there another part?
Or do we have to deal with every sufferings we face? Or do we choose to suffer? This one is worth suffering for, and this one is not suffering for. I get confused.
Okay. Thank you. So is suffering sometimes worth it in order to have happiness?
This is we have the practice of selective watering. Our practice here is that we want to water the good and beautiful quality inside of us, to nourish ourselves and to nourish our loved one and even our ancestors, to continue them beautifully. And listening to your question, and I'm thinking of the word selective suffering. And it's perfectly okay to me. We select, but what kind of suffering? Suffering about the body, physically or mentally? We suffer because of what? If we know the reason, we know what is the definition of that suffer that we are dealing with, then for me, I think that my practice, I choose to suffer. I choose to suffer to a crisis in my life. My mom, she kept telling me that that's life, you know. Why you have to suffer? It's just the nature. It's just nature like that. Why you have to suffer so much because of your beloved passed away? That's what she told me. And then, if I listening deeply to her, then I would lessen my suffering at that time when I lost someone I love a lot. But I didn't listen to her, or I can put it that I didn't believe her. Oh, it just doesn't make sense to me at all. Life, that's life, and we have to endure it. I'm not satisfied with that response or console from my mom. So I chose to suffer a little bit more. There was day that I chose to not eat. There was day that I chose to just sit very still and recite the Buddha's name for my loved one who passed away. I chose to do all these things, and I know that these things at that time I didn't consider the things that I did would benefit me, but I feel like I did that to make something that I call merit. I don't eat so that I can gain some kind of merit to send to my loved one. I recited the Buddha's name a lot so that I can gain some merit or sincere, some accomplishment, and that I can send to my late grandma who passed away. And that's what I believe, and I chose to suffer. Even though it's not that worth it. I suffer because out of those things that I did, that I believe to make something fulfillment, it wasn't so beneficial for me, physically and mentally. Physically, I was hungry. Mentally, I wasn't feel very well and feel depressed. So sometimes we in the line of choosing what to do and not to do, and it put us in a spot. Sometimes we just listen to our heart, our intuition, out from what our elder brother shared earlier, deep down from our love and our compassion, our desire want to offer peace and happiness to ourselves and others, then I think whatever we choose would be beneficial. Out from that nectar of compassion, out of that love, and we can always check again. Like our sister said earlier, we can share with our loved one, with our co-practitioner, with our teacher, with the community. And then whatever we do, out of that qualities of beauty and goodness, I think that we don't have to choose a lot. And everything will be worthy because we chose to do, we choose it. Thank you.
So, dear brothers and sisters, I think sometimes when we choose to stay in a situation of suffering, for myself, oftentimes it's because there's a fear, and we have to kind of identify that fear to understand why we choose to stay in the situation of suffering. Sometimes we fear maybe that we've invested all of this time maybe in a relationship, and that would have been wasted if we leave the relationship. Or sometimes we fear of doing something else. We fear of changing the situation. We have a fear of getting out of that suffering because we don't know another way. So there's a fear of starting a new life that we don't know much about. So first we have to kind of identify our fear. Why? First identify the suffering. What are you suffering from? And why are you choosing to stay in that situation of suffering? What are the fears that you have that would allow you not to leave that situation of suffering? And we have to be very specific. We have to be able to identify our suffering, not just to say, oh, it's suffering, because our suffering is often very specific to something. Maybe the relationship that we're in is not nurturing us in some way or another. It could be because we are exposed to very toxic kind of forms of communication every single day. And we're afraid to leave that because maybe we think, it's much more difficult to start a new life, much more difficult to do something else. in the meantime, we can also, once we identify specifically what the suffering is, whether it's because of toxic communication, whether it's, we can begin to change it already. I just want to say, I have brothers and sisters too who are married, and for a while I could identify the toxins in their relationship, and every time I go home on home visit or go visit other people, one of the biggest, I think, sources of suffering in a relationship is communication and the way that we communicate with one another. And many relationships I observe, every single day we say toxic things to each other all the time, and we've become desensitized to it. So these harsh words, these very hurtful words that we just very naturally say to one another has become normal to us. And we continue to suffer, and yet we just say, we don't know, we don't understand why we have to suffer like that. But in fact, we have to look deeply at how we're communicating. Not just the other person saying toxic things to us, but are we saying toxic things back to the other person? And I find this is, for my own family, this is one of the biggest sources of suffering. The way we communicate to one another and the way we're not able to acknowledge the goodness in one another on a daily basis, and just provide the kind of speech that allows the other person to have more energy to go through the day, allow the other person to have more hope, allow the other person to have more self-confidence. For instance, we're not using that kind of speech with one another. And very often we, particularly in relationships, I find a lot of the suffering comes from the toxic form of communication that we have with one another. So it's a matter of learning how to listen and learning how to speak in such a way that we inspire one another, support one another, and water the seeds of happiness and joy in one another. So if you just take a day or two to look into your situation of suffering and see, how have I contributed to this situation of suffering? What are my actions? What are my thinking? What are the kind of speech that I'm using to this? How am I contributing to this relationship or to this situation of suffering? And you can always identify the kinds of toxins that we emit, and this isn't just to put blame on ourselves and to feel guilty over it, etc. But we have to be realistic. We have to look at the situation boldly. And when we do so, we can find a way, For instance, every day, if you have a partner and you just say, and it comes very normal maybe to you over some time of practice, you're useless, you just say something like that. You're no good, you're good for nothing, for instance. And every day you say this, every time you're upset or you're angry, you just say, you're useless, or you always do that, and you're no good for nothing. And the other person has to hear this every single day. So he becomes, he has his defenses up also when he listens to these things, and he shuts down. And instead, so you can identify patterns in your speech where you're watering, you're touching off in the other person, seeds of distrust, mistrust, or that where you're shutting down the other person and not allowing the other person to open up. You can identify your speech patterns to see how you've contributed to the situation of suffering. And instead of saying you're useless or whatever, you're no good for nothing. When someone says, oh, I can't do that, or I can't help you with that today, you can learn how to ask other questions, you know. Are you busy with something else? You know, are you too busy now? Can I help you instead to do whatever that you need to do? And then you can help me, for instance. So it's a kind of speech we call loving speech in Plum Village. And Sister Chung Kong is master of it. And I think if you want to know more about loving speech, you can speak to her and she'll give you many very practical pointers in loving speech, or any of our brothers and sisters as well. And the other part is listening. How are we listening to the other person? Are we even capable of listening to them? Or they share something to us and it touches off our anger and frustration and we just lash out right away. We don't listen anymore. So I find in relationships, especially when there's suffering, it has a lot to do with communication, with how we listen and how we communicate with one another. Because when we can't listen, when we can't communicate, it says a lot about our own understanding of the other person. And here we say, you know, love is understanding. Yeah? So we try to cultivate our understanding of ourselves and the other person, and that's the way we cultivate love. And that, I believe, changes the situation of suffering. Yeah. Thank you.
So, dear Thai, dear Sangha, this will be the last question.
Dear Thai, dear community, I wanted to ask the sisters and brothers how to transform strong emotions if you don't understand where it comes from. I have a lot of sadness, and even with calming myself and deep looking, I don't know where it comes from. So I would like to know how I can practice. Thank you.
Dear Thai, dear Sangha, thank you for your question. So, this is a question about looking deeply, and we all know that looking deeply is part of the practice. And yet there are times when we have feelings in us that seem to come from nowhere, and there doesn't seem to be any immediate cause. And I have this experience as well, that and we look and we look and we look and we try to understand where does this come from, and there doesn't seem to be an answer right away. So there's a few things that we can do concretely. And this is also a little bit in relation to a written question, which is about the fifth exercise of the 16 exercises of mindful breathing. If we're familiar with the 16 exercises, we know that the fifth exercise is to generate a feeling of joy. And the sixth is to generate a feeling of happiness. And only the seventh is to get in touch with the feeling of suffering and to try to calm it down and look deeply into it. And I notice for myself that that's a kind of mistake that I often make, that I want to go straight for the suffering. I want to understand it, I want to get in touch with it, and sometimes I see that I haven't yet given myself a sufficiently solid ground of joy and happiness and peace. And so if I go too soon to the suffering, I have a tendency to actually go into it and get caught by it a little bit, and even maybe nourish it to some extent. So that, just as a general rule, for myself, I try to remind myself every time I do sitting meditation, every time I do walking meditation, every time I do any kind of practice, to make sure that I'm generating joy, cultivating a feeling of joy. It gives us strength. It gives us the strength to and the stability to be able to face the difficult things. And then when I'm in touch with a feeling of sadness or sorrow, or even a kind of unidentified feeling of suffering or dis-ease, something I may not even know what to call it yet, but I know it's unpleasant. Then we can distinguish. We can find out where is it already? Is it in the body? Is it in the mind? In the form of images? Or is it in the mind in the form of words, of mental discourse? So at least there's those three realms: a feeling in the body, images in the mind, and words in the mind. And they may be a mixture of all three. And so that already starts to help us to identify more clearly what is happening. And then to notice that the feeling is never staying the same, that it's constantly changing. So for myself, I find the most helpful thing is to be in touch with the feeling in the body primarily, and to quiet the mental discourse as much as possible, and just stay with the feeling in an open way, not needing to know, but just to say, oh, hello, my feeling of suffering. I know you're there, and it's okay for you to be there. I'm here for you. To let the feeling know that it's okay. It's okay for it to be there. Because there may be a tendency to try to resolve it right away, and to understand it right away, and even to kind of fix it right away in some way. And that from the point of view of the experience of the feeling of the body, it's a kind of rejection. It's kind of like, I don't want you. I want you to stop. I want you to go away. So it's important to let the feeling know that actually it's okay. It's okay for you to be there. And it's okay for you to be what you are. And it's okay for me not to know what you are or where you come from. And we have to be very careful not to be in a relationship of victimhood to the feeling. Any feeling of suffering, usually we feel like, oh, why do I have to endure this? This is so unpleasant, and I don't want to feel this way. I want to feel something nice, like happiness or peace. So we are in a relationship of feeling like a victim of that suffering, and we want to push it away. But again, that is not conducive to allowing the feeling to unfold and reveal itself to us. It's like a little child that's crying, and if we give any hint that it's not okay to cry, then the child will only feel more upset. And I think as a mother, you know that. So we really need to let the feeling know that it's okay, I accept you as you are. And to be very patient with that. And to genuinely experience it. To fully experience that feeling, to receive it with dignity. To say, I fully receive you. I'm ready to receive whatever message it is that you bring. And when we're able to do that, and really be there for the feeling without any judgment, without any sense of pushing it away, then perhaps something will unfold, something will reveal itself, and we can see another layer. Maybe not the whole thing yet, but one more layer. Maybe we discover under the sadness there's something else. Maybe there's a different feeling. Maybe it's not what we thought at first. But for myself, the main thing is to generate that space of total acceptance and non-judgment and openness to whatever is there, and a kind of equanimity. So to experiment with the idea that maybe this is actually okay. Maybe it's actually okay to feel this. Maybe this is not suffering. Maybe it's only my way of handling it, which is suffering. Maybe actually just being here, following my breath, being with this feeling, maybe it's not so intolerable as I thought. Maybe it's actually bearable. And then it's like playing music. Our feelings respond to music very well. And the best kind of music is the breath. Breathing in, breathing out. We accompany the feeling, and we let it listen to that very gentle music of the breath, and it can reveal itself to us. Thank you. the Thai de Sangha. Let us listen to 3 sounds of the bell. And then perhaps there will be some announcements, and then we can go for walking meditation. Thank you so much.